I want to warn you about something before starting this story. It's one of those that stays with you. A follower named Gabriel from Argentina sent it to me, and when I read it, I had to pause halfway to catch my breath for a moment. Gabriel is 43 years old, a rural doctor, and what he describes happened in a town in the province of Corrientes, where he was assigned for a year. A town where the neighbors had a relationship with the dead that Gabriel did not expect to find, and where he discovered that there are people who don't fully leave even though one believes they have already gone. If you're hearing this for the first time, welcome. And if you have your own story kept away, you know where to find me. Let's go with Gabriel's account. I arrived in Paso Oscuro in July with a medium suitcase, my medical bag, and the conviction that a year in the countryside would do me good. I was 36 years old then. I had been working in hospitals in Buenos Aires for almost a decade, in emergencies, in the kind of environment where time always runs too fast and where one ends up treating symptoms instead of people. The exhaustion I had accumulated was not just physical, although that too, but a deeper one, that of someone who has lost the ability to see the patient as something more than a problem to be solved. I needed distance. I needed silence. I needed to remember why I had chosen this profession. The Rural Doctors Program assigned me to Paso Oscuro in the northeast of Corrientes, near the border with Paraguay. A village of 300 people without a hospital, with a small first aid room that depended on the on-duty doctor to function. The previous doctor had requested a transfer after 8 months without giving too many explanations. That should have told me something, but at that moment I read it as a personal incompatibility with isolation, something that in my state of exhaustion seemed completely understandable. The village was exactly what I imagined and also completely different. The low houses, the red dirt roads, the humid heat of July that in Corrientes does not mean winter, but a toned-down version of summer. The nearby river that could be heard at night. The birds I didn't know, with sounds that took me weeks to learn to identify. The people were kind but measured. The kind of kindness that is earned over time, not through presence. I settled into the house that the municipality had designated for the doctor, a modest but comfortable building, with a backyard that opened up to an open field where, on the first nights, I would sit and gaze at a sky with more stars than I had seen in years. My main contact in the village was the nurse in the ward, a woman named Teresa, about 50 years old, a lifelong resident of Corrientes, with a practical knowledge of local medicine that far exceeded any theoretical training. Teresa knew who had what, which herbs families used before coming to the ward, and which customs of the village were better respected without questioning them too much. She explained that last part to me in our first work conversation. "Dr. Gabriel," he said to me with that tone of his that mixed warmth with frankness without either yielding to the other. "Here people have their ways, ways of healing, ways of dying, ways of mourning. If you come with the idea that everything that is not textbook medicine is ignorance, you are going to have a very difficult year." I told him that I wasn't coming with that idea. Teresa looked at me for a moment, as if evaluating the statement. "Good," she said. "Then we will get along well." And we got along well during the first few weeks. I learned the rhythm of the town, the frequent patients, the common pathologies of the area. I learned to read the Corrientes weather, which could change in hours from a blue summer sky to a storm that shook the roof sheets for hours. I learned to sleep with the heat and with the sounds of the countryside that at first kept me alert, and that over time became as familiar as silence. The first month was exactly what I had gone to look for. The first sign that Paso Oscuro had something I did not expect to find came in the third week when Mr. Agustin died. Don Agustin was the oldest man in the village, 92 years old, with a medical history that was basically a summary of everything that can survive a human body if it has enough will. I had attended to him twice in my first weeks for minor issues, and he seemed to me to be one of those men who seem impossible to die because they have lived for so long that death seems to have forgotten about them. He died at night in his bed, apparently without pain, according to what his daughter told me when she came to inform me the next morning. I went to certify the death, as is proper. Don Agustin's house was large and old, with that particular smell of spaces inhabited for decades by the same person. A mix of old tobacco, wood, and something sweet that I couldn't identify. What caught my attention was not the dead man, of whom I had seen enough in my years of emergencies, but what I found in the room. All the mirrors were covered, not with improvised fabrics, but with dark fabrics that clearly existed for that purpose, kept for when the moment arrived, placed with a precision that indicated practice. The The windows were also partially covered, allowing light in but not the view from outside. And on the floor, around the bed, there was a continuous line of something that at first I thought was salt, but when I bent down to check, turned out to be a mixture of salt with other things I couldn't identify. Small seeds, something dark that could have been burnt earth, crushed, dried herbs. Don Agustin's daughter, a lady in her 60s named Elisa, watched me as I looked at all this with an expression that mixed courtesy with something that could have been caution. "It's the custom," she simply said, as if anticipating my question. "What is the line on the floor for?" I asked, trying to maintain a neutral tone. "So that Mr. Agustin knows where he is," Elisa said. "So that he doesn't get confused and stays when he has to leave." I didn't ask any more at that moment. I did my job, signed what I had to sign, and left. That afternoon I asked Teresa about what I had seen. Teresa listened and then took a moment before responding with that gesture of hers of someone who chooses their words carefully. "Here the dead are important," she said. "Not in the way you are thinking. It's not just mourning, it's not just respect. It's that here people know from generations of experience that there are dead who do not leave on their own, that they need help to go, and there are dead who do not want to leave." "And the line on the ground?" "It's to guide them," Teresa said. "Salt and other things. It marks the path out. If the dead rise before being taken, the line indicates where they should exit." "If the dead rise," I repeated. Teresa looked at me. "Dr. Gabriel, I have been in this town for 50 years. I have seen things that are not in any medical book. And I have learned that when the people here do something I don't understand, there is usually a good reason behind it." I didn't say anything more on the subject, but I started to pay more attention. In the following weeks, I noticed things that had previously gone unnoticed in the noise of the first days. The wakes in Paso Oscuro always lasted exactly 2 nights, never less. During those 2 nights, someone was always awake next to the body, without exception, regardless of the hour. The windows of the mourning houses always had a candle lit visible from the street, and no one, absolutely no one, spoke the name of the deceased aloud during the 3 days following the burial. I asked Teresa about that last part. "If you name him, you call him," she said. "And if he hasn't finished leaving yet, he comes. Has that happened?" Teresa looked at me for a long moment. "Yes," she said. She didn't elaborate. And something in the way she said it indicated to me that was the limit of what she was going to share at that moment. 2 more months passed without any event that deviated from what I had begun to consider the normal range of dark passage. Dead with their rituals, customs that I respected without fully understanding, Teresa, who taught me the ways of the village with the patience of someone used to introducing strangers to a world that is not their own. Then Mrs. Ramona died. Ramona was 78 years old and had been, according to Teresa, the most respected person in the village for decades. Not for an official position, but for knowledge. She was the one who knew. She knew about plants, bodies, dreams, and the dead. People would go to see her before going to the doctor for certain things. And Teresa, with an honesty I always appreciated, told me directly on the first day, "There are things for which they come to you, and things for which they went to Ramona. And the things of Ramona you cannot attend to even if you want to." Ramona died on a Wednesday in September. Her grandson found her in the morning, in her bed, apparently at peace. I went to certify the death as always. Ramona's house was different from the others in the village. Larger, with an inner courtyard full of plants that grew with a density and health that seemed to defy the dry heat of September, with a number of objects on the walls and shelves that told decades of life. The mirrors were covered. The line of salt and herbs surrounded the bed, everything according to custom. But there was something else in Don Agustin's house. On Ramona's chest they had placed an object. It was not a religious object in the conventional sense. It was something handmade, from materials that I could not identify all, with a shape that had something of a cross, but also something of another thing, something older than the cross. Ramona's grandson, a young man of about 20 named Nico, watched me as I looked at it. "So that Grandma can leave in peace," he said. "She prepared it herself a long time ago. She said that when her time came, it had to be placed there." "Did she know she was going to die soon?" Nico looked at me with an expression that mixed the pain of mourning with something harder to describe. "Grandma knew many things," he said. She used to say that what worried her most about dying was not being able to leave properly, that there are things that cling on. What kind of things? Nico hesitated. She dealt with things that are not from this side, he finally said, her whole life. And she said that when you work with those things, sometimes they leave a mark, and that mark can make it difficult to pass on. I kept thinking about that for the rest of the day. Ramona's wake was different from the others I had witnessed in the town. More people, more silence, a solemnity that exceeded normal mourning. Teresa was present the entire first night. I stayed for a while, offered my respects, and left at midnight. It was on the second night of the wake when everything changed. It was 2 in the morning when they knocked on my door. It was Nico. He had the face of someone who has seen something they cannot process, an expression of bewilderment rather than fear, like when reality does something that is not in any of your frameworks to interpret it. "Doctor, you have to come," he said. "What happened?" "Grandma." I went without asking more. Ramona's house was full of people, all those who had been keeping vigil, all standing, all looking towards the room where the body was. No one spoke. The silence had a texture I had never experienced before, something that was not just absence of sound but an active presence, as if the silence itself had weight. Teresa was near the door of the room. When she saw me arrive, she gestured with her head, which I interpreted as come. I entered the room. Ramona was in her bed, exactly as I had left her hours before, with the object on her chest, surrounded by the line on the floor. Nothing visibly different, but the object on her chest had changed position, not dramatically. Just a few centimeters, a slight turn, as if someone had moved it carefully. But no one had entered the room since I had left, Teresa told me in a very low voice when she approached. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Sure," she said. "There's always someone watching." No one came in. "And the line?" Teresa pointed with her eyes. I looked at the floor. The line was intact on 3 sides of the bed. On the 4th side, the one facing the window, there was an interruption, a small arc, as if something the size of a foot had rested on the line from the inside. From inside the perimeter marked by the line, from where the body was. I stood completely still, staring at that. "What does it mean?" I asked. Teresa took a while to respond. "Ramona is still here," she said. "Or something of Ramona. She didn't finish leaving." "And what do we do?" Teresa looked at me. "There is a person in the village who knows what to do in this case," she said. But that person was Ramona. The silence that followed that sentence lasted several seconds. "Is there no one else?" "There is a woman in a village 40 kilometers away," Teresa said. "But I don't know if she'll make it in time." "Time for what?" "The second night is always the critical one," Teresa said. "If something doesn't finish leaving after the second night, it stays. And something that stays without wanting to can cause harm without intending to." They sent for the woman from the 40-kilometer village. She arrived at dawn, a lady of about 70 years whom they simply called the aunt, with a leather bag full of things she didn't show me and that I didn't ask about. She entered the room, asked everyone to leave, and closed the door. We waited outside for almost an hour. When the aunt came out, she had an expression of deep fatigue, the kind that doesn't come from staying up all night, but from something more demanding. "It's done," she said. "Ramona left well. No one asked for details. Neither did I. But before the aunt left, while waiting outside with her leather bag, I approached to talk to her. I don't know exactly why. Something about that woman, in her way of moving and speaking, generated in me the same kind of respect that doctors with decades of clinical experience do, someone who has seen so much that they no longer need to prove it. I asked her what had happened exactly. Aunt looked at me for a moment before responding. Then she said something I have thought about many times since then. Ramona spent her life working on the boundary between this side and the other. And when one works on that boundary, part of oneself learns to be on both sides at the same time. When Ramona died, that part didn't want to let go. Not out of malice, just out of habit. She had to be convinced that it was no longer necessary. And how do you convince that? With respect, said the aunt. With the right words. And reminding her that there is more on the other side than here. She left before I could ask her anything else. I finished my year in Paso Oscuro in July as planned. I didn't ask for an extension. I didn't ask for an early transfer. I lived the full 12 months and left when it was time. In that year, I learned things that are not in any medical book and that I could not explain in terms that would satisfy a colleague from Buenos Aires. I learned that there are ways to die that require more care than others. I learned that Teresa's knowledge of the body included dimensions that I had not studied. I learned that some customs that at first seemed like superstition turned out to have a functionality that I could not ignore after what I saw. But there is one thing in particular that I brought back from Paso Oscuro that I cannot shake off. The night after Aunt did what she did in Ramona's room, I went home as dawn was beginning to break. I was exhausted in a way that was not just physical. I sat in the backyard watching the field gradually light up with the early light, and I had the feeling that someone was standing behind me. That's interesting. Sometimes our minds play tricks on us, especially in the early morning when we're still waking up. It could have been just a shadow or a trick of the light. Ramona respected you, Doctor. She said you were one of those who know how to listen even if they don't understand, that it's rare. Do you think it was Ramona that I felt? Teresa thought before answering. I think Ramona left well, he said. Aunt did well. But sometimes before leaving completely, those who are leaving pass through the places and people that mattered to them. Just to say goodbye. I don't know if I believe that. I'm a doctor. I'm a person of scientific training. I have every reason in the world to seek rational explanations for everything I experience. And yet there are things I lived in Paso Oscuro that don't fit into any explanation that completely satisfies me. I came to that town to recover something I had lost in the years of emergencies. The ability to see patients as whole people, as complex stories, not just as symptoms. And I recovered it, although in ways I didn't expect. I also brought back something I didn't ask for but that I can't return either. The certainty, which comes from having been present and having seen with my own eyes, that there are things on the edge of life and death that the medicine I studied does not cover. I don't know exactly what those things are. But now, when I have a patient who is near the end, I am more careful, more attentive, more willing to take seriously things that I would have dismissed before. And when someone tells me that there are dead who need help to leave, it no longer allows me to smile with superiority. I just nod, because I have been in the yard of a house in Corrientes at dawn, and something has looked at me before dissolving into the light. And I don't forget that. So far, the story of Gabriel. He wrote to me that he continues practicing medicine, now in a provincial clinic, far from the emergencies of Buenos Aires that exhausted him. He says that Teresa and he write to each other from time to time, and that the town remains the same, with its customs and its dead well cared for. What stuck with me the most from his story is that idea that respect for what we do not understand can be more useful than trying to explain everything. Sometimes the oldest wisdom has reasons that science has yet to name. If you have a story that comes from your family, from your town, from a tradition that always seemed more real to you than you could admit, write to me. I would love to narrate it. Good night, and sleep well. This experience was shared with me by Laura, a primary school teacher who inherited her great-grandmother's house in a rural town in Chiapas. What she found hidden in the walls made her discover a family secret that had been hidden for generations. If you have inherited something that perhaps you shouldn't have received, tell me in the comments. Now let me take you to the story of Laura and the mirror that should never have been opened. My name is Laura, and I am a primary school teacher in Mexico City. I am 32 years old, live alone, and until a year ago, my life was completely normal and predictable. That changed when I received a call from a notary in Chiapas, informing me that my great-grandmother Celestina had passed away at the age of 98, leaving me her house as an inheritance. I barely remembered my great-grandmother. I had only seen her twice in my childhood, during brief family visits to her village. She lived in San Cristobal de las Casas, in a colonial house that had belonged to our family for over 100 years. She was a small and quiet woman, with penetrating black eyes that seemed to see things others could not. My mother turned pale when I told her about the inheritance. Don't go to that house, Laura. Sell it without seeing it. There are things in that family that are better left buried. What things? You've never told me anything about great-grandmother Celestina. Because there is nothing good to tell. That woman practiced things. Witchcraft, sorcery. I don't know exactly. My grandmother warned me never to get too close to her. Please, Laura, just sell the house and forget about all this. But I was naturally curious, and the idea of having a property in San Cristobal, a beautiful tourist city, was too tempting to ignore. So during the summer vacation, I traveled to Chiapas to see my inheritance. The house was in the oldest neighborhood of the city, on a narrow cobblestone street surrounded by colonial buildings. It was 2 stories high, with thick adobe walls painted a faded yellow, and a central courtyard with a dry fountain covered in moss. The windows had wrought iron bars, and the front door was made of solid wood carved with symbols I did not recognize. The notary handed me the keys along with a sealed envelope. Your great-grandmother left this for you. Specific instructions that it should only be opened after her death. I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in shaky handwriting. Laura, if you are reading this, I have died and the house is now yours. But with the house comes a responsibility that our family has maintained for 5 generations. In the room on the 2nd floor, the one at the end of the hallway, you will find a sealed door. Behind that door is something that must remain closed. It is a burden, but also a protection. Never, under any circumstances, open that door. If you do, you will release something that I have kept contained for 70 years. If you decide not to accept this responsibility, sell the house. But make sure the new owner understands that door must never be opened. Your great-grandmother, Celestina. A chill ran through me as I read. What kind of thing needed to be kept sealed for 70 years? My natural skepticism suggested that my great-grandmother had simply been a superstitious woman, perhaps with mild mental issues in her old age. There was probably some sentimental object or embarrassing family document she wanted to keep hidden. I entered the house with my suitcase, determined to spend a few days assessing the property before deciding whether to sell it or keep it. The interior was surprisingly well preserved. The furniture was old but sturdy. There was electricity and running water, and although everything was covered in dust, the structure seemed to be in good condition. The 1st floor had a spacious living room, a dining room, a kitchen with a wood stove, and a small bathroom that had been added more recently. I climbed the wooden stairs that creaked under my weight. The 2nd floor had 3 rooms. The first 2 were regular bedrooms with old beds, wardrobes, and windows that faced the street. The 3rd room, at the end of the hallway, was different. The door was covered with symbols painted in red. I recognized some as Christian crosses, but others were strange. Circles with intersecting lines, complex geometric shapes, words in what seemed to be Latin, and over the entire surface of the door, someone had nailed dozens of small wooden crosses, forming a dense barrier. I tried to open the door, more out of curiosity than genuine intent. It was locked with 3 different padlocks, and the keys were not on the keyring that the notary had given me. Furthermore, someone had sealed the edges of the door with red wax, as if they wanted to ensure that not even air could enter or exit. My rational side said this was ridiculous. There were probably dead rats or toxic mold inside, and my great-grandmother, being superstitious, had dealt with the problem using rituals instead of professional exterminators. I decided that the next day I would call a locksmith to open the door, clean whatever was causing the problem, and then I could use that extra room to increase the value of the house. That night I slept in one of the unlocked rooms. The house made constant noises, like all old structures, creaking wood, whispers of wind through cracks, the occasional scratch of branches against the windows. I fell asleep listening to these sounds, finding them almost comforting in their normalcy. I woke up at 3 in the morning with the absolute certainty that I was not alone in the house. It wasn't a specific sound that woke me up. It was a sensation, a presence. The air in my room had become thick, hard to breathe. The temperature had dropped significantly, and my breath was visible in the air. I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate, moving from the stairs toward the end of the corridor, toward the sealed door. I froze in bed, my heart pounding wildly. The footsteps stopped in front of the sealed door. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of someone trying to open the door from the inside. The doorknob was shaking violently. Something was banging against the wood from within, each thud louder than the last. The locks jingled, the wooden crosses vibrated, and a voice, low, raspy, pleading, "Let me out, please. I've been here so long. Let me out." I forced myself out of bed, trembling. I grabbed my cell phone, turned on the flashlight, and cautiously peeked into the hallway. It was empty. The footsteps had ceased. The knocking had stopped. The sealed door was exactly as I had left it, unchanged, but I could feel something behind it. A conscious presence, waiting, watching. I retreated to my room and spent the rest of the night with the lights on, the door locked, and my suitcase ready by the bed, in case I needed to flee quickly. The next morning, with the daylight giving me false courage, I decided to investigate. If I was going to sell this house or keep it, I needed to know what was really going on. I searched the entire house for documents, diaries, anything that would explain the history of that sealed room. In the attic, I found an old metal box filled with papers. It contained family records dating back to 1890, letters, faded photographs, and a diary written by my great-grandmother. I sat on the dusty floor of the attic and began to read. The story that emerged from those yellowed pages was much darker than I had imagined. My great-grandmother Celestina had been a healer and midwife, following a family tradition that spanned generations, but she also practiced other arts, spiritual cleansings, protection rituals, and occasionally darker magic when requested and well paid. In 1952, when she was 28 years old, a wealthy woman named Dolores Espinosa hired her for a specific job. Dolores had discovered that her husband had a mistress and wanted revenge. Not the common kind of revenge, but something permanent, something that would completely destroy the husband and the mistress. Celestina, needing the money, agreed. She performed a forbidden ritual, one that invoked what she called in her diary, the hungry ones, entities that fed on human souls. The ritual required a sacrifice, something alive with innocent blood. Celestina sacrificed a newborn lamb, pouring its blood into an ancient silver mirror while reciting words in a language that was not Spanish. The hungry ones came. The diary pages described how the mirror had darkened, how twisted shapes had materialized on its surface, how they had promised to fulfill the revenge in exchange for a future payment. Dolores' husband and her lover died 3 days later under horrific circumstances. Their bodies were found completely drained of blood, with expressions of absolute terror frozen on their faces. The police investigation never found an explanation, but the hungry did not leave after fulfilling their part. They demanded more. They appeared in the mirror, whispering, demanding that Celestina bring them more souls, more blood. They tormented her day and night. Desperate, Celestina sought help from a priest who understood the occult. Together they performed a sealing ritual. They locked the mirror in that room on the second floor, covered the door with protective symbols, and sealed everything with blessings and prayers. The last entry in the diary, written just a month before her death, said, "I have kept them contained for 70 years, but I can feel the seal weakening. Soon someone will have to reinforce it, or break it completely and face the consequences. May God forgive my sins and protect whoever comes after me." I closed the diary with trembling hands. This couldn't be real. The hungry ones, demonic spirits trapped in a mirror, blood rituals. It was too fantastical to believe. But I had heard the knocks at the door. I had felt the presence. And I knew, on some deep and instinctive level, that my great-grandmother was not crazy. She had been protecting the family, the town, from something genuinely dangerous. I should have left the house at that moment. I should have sealed everything, never come back, maybe even burned the place to the ground. But part of me, the curious and rational part that couldn't accept the supernatural without direct evidence, needed to see. I hired a locksmith the next day. He was an older man from the village who looked at the sealed door with an uncomfortable expression. "Miss, this door was sealed for a reason. Doña Celestina was very specific about this. No one was to open it. She was my great-grandmother, and now this is my house. I just want to see what's inside." He shook his head but did his job. The 3 locks were removed one by one. He scraped the red wax from the edges. The small wooden crosses were carefully taken off and placed in a bag. "I won't go in with you," he said when he finished, "and I advise you not to do so either. But if you insist, at least wait until noon, with the sun high. Never open sealed doors in the dark." It was 11 in the morning. I paid him, and he left quickly, almost running out of the house. I waited until exactly noon, just as suggested. The sun streamed through the hallway windows, illuminating everything brightly. With a trembling hand, I turned the doorknob and pushed the door. It opened with a long, creaking groan. The air that came out was cold and stale, with a metallic smell that reminded me of old blood. The room was completely empty except for one thing, a full-length mirror in the center, covered with a black cloth. The mirror was antique, with an intricately wrought silver frame. Even covered, it emanated something that made me want to step back. The air around it seemed to vibrate slightly, like heat rising from asphalt in summer. I took a step into the room, then another. I approached the covered mirror, extending my hand toward the black cloth. At the moment my fingers touched the fabric, voices exploded in my head. Not one voice, but dozens, hundreds, all speaking simultaneously in different languages, some pleading, others threatening, others simply screaming without words. I ripped the fabric away in one pull. The mirror beneath did not reflect the room. Its surface was completely black, like a well of infinite darkness. And as I looked, that darkness began to move, swirling, forming patterns and shapes. I saw faces emerging from the darkness, human faces but distorted, stretching in agony, mouths open in silent screams, and behind them, larger, less human shapes. The hungry. They were difficult to describe because their form changed constantly. Sometimes they appeared to be masses of dark tentacles, other times, collections of eyes and mouths, but always hungry, always searching, always wanting. One of them pressed against the surface of the mirror from within. I saw its distorted shape pressing against what seemed to be an invisible glass, trying to break it, to cross into the real world. And then it spoke, not with sound but directly in my mind. "Liberator, you have broken the seal. Now we can come out. We can feed again." I recoiled, horrified. "No, I didn't break anything. The mirror still contains you. The seal of your ancestor weakened with her death. The prayers that kept it strong were silenced. Only the closed door kept us asleep. But now the door is open. We are awakening, and soon, when darkness falls, we will cross." I ran out of the room, stumbled down the stairs, and stepped into the bright street under the midday sun. My heart was pounding so hard that I thought I might faint. I wandered aimlessly through the streets of San Cristobal for hours, trying to process what I had seen, what I had heard. It wasn't my imagination. The hungry were real, and I had opened the door that kept them sealed. When the sun began to set, I knew I couldn't just run away. If what those things had said was true, if they were going to cross when darkness fell, I needed to do something. But what? I didn't know anything about rituals or sealing. I wasn't a healer or a witch like my great-grandmother. Desperate, I sought help. I discreetly asked in the village for someone who understood the occult, the spiritual. Several people directed me to a woman named Soledad, who lived on the outskirts of the city and had a reputation as a healer. I found her in a small house surrounded by gardens full of medicinal herbs. She was older, perhaps 60 years, with long braided gray hair and eyes that reminded me of my great-grandmother. I told her everything: the mirror, the hungry ones, what my great-grandmother had done 70 years ago. I expected her to think I was crazy, but instead, her expression grew serious. "I knew Doña Celestina," she said. "She taught me many things before she warned me never to follow in her footsteps in the darker arts." She knew about the mirror. All true healers in the region knew it. It was her burden, her penance for the mistake she made in her youth. "Can you help me seal them again?" Soledad hesitated. "I can try, but the original sealing took the strength of Doña Celestina and a consecrated priest, working together for 3 days, and even then, they could only contain them, not destroy them, without your great-grandmother alive to maintain the ritual. So what do I do? Do I let them out? Let them feed on whoever they find? No. There is another option. I can teach you to transfer the sealing, to take your great-grandmother's place as the guardian of the mirror, but it would mean you would have to stay here, in this house, keeping the prayers and protections active. It would be your life, your responsibility, just as it was for her." I looked at the darkening sky. I have no choice, do I? If I run away, they escape and kill innocent people. There is always a choice, Laura, but some options have consequences we cannot live with. We returned to the house together just as the sun was completely setting. I could feel the difference immediately. The air inside the house was charged, vibrating with a malevolent energy. The hungry were awake and active. We went up to the second floor. The door to the sealed room was wide open now, although I was sure I had closed it when I left. The mirror glowed with its own light, pulsing like a heart. The shapes within the mirror pressed against the surface more forcefully now. Fine cracks began to appear in the glass. We didn't have much time. Soledad worked quickly, drawing symbols on the ground with blessed chalk, lighting candles, burning herbs that filled the room with acrid smoke. She instructed me to kneel in the center of a circle she had traced. The transfer ritual requires you to willingly accept the burden, she explained. You must promise to maintain the seal, perform daily prayers, never abandon your post. It is a binding oath, not only with humans but with spiritual forces. Do you understand? I understand. And do you accept? I thought of my life in Mexico City, my job as a teacher, my friends, my apartment, my freedom. All of that would have to end if I accepted this. I would be bound to this house, to this town, keeping a constant vigil over a cursed mirror. But if I refused, people would die. The hungry would feed, and it would all be my fault for having opened that door. I accept, I said. Soledad began to sing in a mix of Spanish, Latin, and what sounded like an ancient indigenous language. She made me repeat words I didn't fully understand. The smoke from the herbs swirled around us in patterns that did not follow the normal flow of air. The mirror reacted violently. The cracks on its surface expanded. The hungry inside roared, pounded, tried to break free completely before the ritual was completed. I felt something changing within me, a connection forming, invisible but undeniable, between my soul and the mirror. It was as if it had taken root in this place, permanently binding me to the ground beneath the house. The final words of the ritual left my mouth, and a wave of energy exploded from the circle. The cracks in the mirror closed instantly. The pulsing light dimmed. The hungry inside recoiled, pushed back into the depths of the mirror, sealed once again. The silence that followed was absolute. Loneliness stopped singing. The smoke began to dissipate, and I remained kneeling in the circle, feeling the weight of what I had just accepted. It is done, Soledad said softly. You are the guardian now. The mirror is sealed again, but the seal must be reinforced every day with prayers. I will teach you the words, and you can never ever abandon this vigilance. If you do, they will escape immediately. That was a year ago. I quit my job in Mexico City, sold my apartment, and moved permanently to San Cristobal de las Casas. I got a job teaching at a local school, but my true job is another. Every morning and every night, I go up to the second floor, enter that room, and recite the sealing prayers. I burn the specific herbs. I renew the protection symbols. I keep the hungry contained. Sometimes I hear them whispering from the mirror, trying to tempt me, persuading me to release them. They promise power, knowledge, riches. Other times they threaten, describing the horrible things they will do to me if I ever let my guard down. I ignore them. I have learned to live with their constant presence, just as my great-grandmother did for 70 years. My family thinks I'm crazy for moving here. My mother won't talk to me, furious that I didn't heed her warning. My friends from the city stopped inviting me to visit when it became clear that I couldn't leave even for a weekend. But I have found a new life here. The children I teach love me. Solitude has become my mentor and friend, teaching me more about traditional healing arts. And there is a strange peace in knowing exactly what my purpose is, why I am here. I am the guardian of the mirror. I keep the hungry contained. I protect the world from the mistakes made by my great-grandmother decades ago. It's a life I never chose, but it's the life I now have. And I will carry it until my last breath, hoping that whoever comes after me is as strong as I needed to be. Thus concludes the story that Laura sent me. She told me that writing this was part of her process of accepting her new reality. She still lives in San Cristobal, still maintains her daily vigilance. If you have ever inherited something that came with responsibilities you never expected, share it in the comments. Sometimes family legacies include burdens we never asked to carry. Sweet dreams, and see you next time. I never thought I would talk about this again. For years I buried it in the deepest part of me, the part where we keep things that don't fit with the version of reality we want to maintain. I am a rational person. I studied graphic design. I work in front of a screen. I live in an apartment on the 4th floor overlooking a noisy street. My life is concrete, measurable, and yet there is something that happened to me 4 years ago that has no explanation that satisfies me. It all started because of a freelance job. I was going through a tough time financially. I had just ended a long relationship. I had to leave the apartment I shared with my ex, and I was living with my mother while I reorganized my life. When a proposal came to me that seemed too good to be true, I didn't think twice. A regional tourism agency needed someone to photograph rural towns in the south. 2 weeks of travel, good pay, independent work. Perfect. I arrived in Llangken, as I will call the town, on a Tuesday in April. The south of Chile in autumn has a beauty that hurts. The trees change color in a way that seems exaggerated, as if nature were competing with the painting. The air smells of wet earth and wood smoke. When the minibus stopped in the town square, I breathed in that air and thought, I am going to be fine here. I stayed at a boarding house run by a lady named Esther. She was a woman in her 70s, petite, with white hair tied up in a bun, and a smile that seemed to hold something. Not necessarily something bad, just something she knew that I did not. The first few days were perfect. I would wake up early, have breakfast with Esther, and go out for walks with my camera. People were shy at first, but friendly. Several invited me to drink mate while telling me stories about the place. It was during those conversations that I began to hear her name, Doña Clementina. The first time I heard it was almost in passing. A lady named Rosa, who had a store full of spices and homemade preserves, mentioned it while she was talking to me about certain festivities in the village. I asked her who it was. Rosa stopped arranging the jars she had in her hand. He lives on the edge of the forest, she said, at the end of the dirt road that goes out to the north, and she changed the subject. The second time was the next day. Father Ignacio, the village priest, a young and nervous man, asked me what areas I had visited. I mentioned that I was thinking of heading north. There's a house at the end of that road, he said carefully. An older woman. I wouldn't recommend spending too much time around there. Doña Clementina, I said without thinking. Father Ignacio looked at me. Who told you that name? Rosa, from the store. He nodded slowly, as if that explained everything. Just be careful, he said. That's all. Of course, that did exactly the opposite of dissuading me. The next day I took the dirt road north. The forest was extraordinary. Tall araucarias, coihus covered in moss, a silence filled with small sounds. I took photos for hours, so absorbed that I didn't realize how far I had walked. When I looked up, I saw the house. It was made of dark wood, darker than the others in the village, as if it had been exposed to the rain for many more years. It had a garden in front that was an explosion of plants growing with no apparent logic. Some I recognized, lavender, rosemary, something that looked like rue. Others were plants I had never seen before, with oddly shaped leaves and flowers in colors that did not match the season. I was photographing the garden from a distance when I heard the voice. What are you photographing, girl? I jumped. At the edge of the garden stood an old woman who hadn't been there a second before. Small, hunched, with dark wrinkled skin like tanned leather, and eyes of a color I couldn't describe. They weren't black, they weren't brown. They were a dark amber, almost golden, that shone strangely under the light filtered by the clouds. The garden, I said. I'm a photographer, doing a job for the tourism agency. The old woman looked at me for a long moment, then she smiled. Valentina, she said. I was frozen. How do you know my name? The village is small, she said. We know who arrives. It was a reasonable answer, and yet something in the way she said it, without asking, without hesitation, as if she had already known before seeing me, made me uncomfortable, which I tried to ignore. I'm Clementina, she said. Come in for something warm, it's cold. I should have said no. I should have listened to Father Ignacio, to Rosa, who with their silences had clearly warned me. But I went in. The house inside was warm and dark. The wood stove was lit, the intense smell of herbs and something smoky and something sweet that I couldn't identify. The walls were covered with shelves filled with glass jars of all sizes, containing colors ranging from dark green to almost black red. Bunches of dried plants hung from the ceiling. On a wooden table, several open books with handwritten notes and drawings that I couldn't see well from where I sat. Clementina prepared tea for me in a handmade ceramic cup of a very deep blue color. The tea had a flavor I didn't recognize, slightly bitter at first, and then sweet, with a floral aroma that I found pleasant. We talked for almost 2 hours. Clementina spoke about medicinal plants, remedies that her mother had taught her, about how the forest had a memory that humans had forgotten how to read, that certain places had an ancient energy, neither good nor bad, and that those who knew how to relate to it could do things that others called miracles or magic depending on the direction of the wind. When I left, the sun was low and I felt light, like after a conversation with someone who really listens to you. That night, while reviewing the photos on my laptop, I noticed something. In a picture of Clementina's garden, taken just before she spoke to me, there was a figure at the edge of the bushes, the hunched silhouette of the old woman, with something in her hand that looked like a long staff. But I clearly remembered that when I took that photo, the garden was empty. I remembered it because I had checked the framing several times looking for the perfect angle. There was no one there. I enlarged the image as much as I could. The figure was unmistakable. I closed the laptop and tried not to think about it anymore. The eye lies sometimes. Photos capture things that the brain filters out. There are explanations. But that night I dreamed of her. In the dream, I was in the forest, and the forest was different, darker, denser, with trees that did not correspond to any real species. The ground was covered with something black and shiny. In a clearing next to a small campfire was Clementina. She was holding something in her hands, the blue cup from which I had drunk the tea. She looked directly at me, with eyes that I knew belonged to something that was also looking outward. "It has already begun," she said. I woke up at 3 in the morning with my heart pounding in my chest. The room was completely dark, except for the rain hitting the zinc roof. I stayed still, listening. Beneath the rain, mixed with it in a way that made it hard to separate, there was a sound, a murmur, like someone speaking very softly just on the other side of my door. A woman's voice, old, repeating something in a constant pattern, like a prayer. I got up without turning on the light, walked to the door, and put my hand on the doorknob. I stayed like that, listening. The voice stopped. The silence that followed was different from normal silence. It had weight, as if the air itself had become thicker. I opened the door. The hallway was empty. A dim bulb illuminated the wooden floor and the other closed doors. But on the ground, in front of my door, there was something. A small bundle, dried herbs, dark seeds, a piece of cloth, all tied with a red thread. I looked at it from above without touching it for a long moment. Then I stepped back and closed the door. The next morning when Esther brought me breakfast, I asked her if she had heard anything in the hallway during the night. She slowly set down the tray. She looked at me. "Did you go see Clementina yesterday?" she asked. "Yes." "How do you know?" "Because that bundle is hers. It's what she does when she wants something from someone." "What does she want?" Esther sat down in front of me. Something she had never done. She always left the breakfast and went away. "Clementina is what they call a flyer in the village," she said. "Do you know what that is?" I had heard the term. In southern Chile, there exists that myth. Women who make pacts with dark forces in exchange for power. The name comes from the belief that they can transform during the night, an ancient legend, predating Catholicism, part of the local folklore. "That's a myth," I said. Esther looked at me with the patience of someone who has seen too much to argue. "She has been in this town for 40 years, she said. "She arrived when she was young. I knew her. She has changed, and the town has changed with her. Animals dying for no reason, people getting sick and no one knows why. The people know, but no one talks because they fear what could happen to them. And Father Ignacio? He has been here for 2 years. The previous priest left without warning after 6 months." I fell silent. "What does the bundle mean?" Esther pressed her lips together. "That marked you. That wants you to come back." I spent the next day without leaving the boarding house, under the pretext of editing photos. But the truth was that I was scared, a fear that I didn't quite know how to face. At 6 in the evening, someone knocked on my door. It was a girl, about 12 years old, long dark hair, a serious expression that didn't match her age. "Doña Clementina wants you to go tonight," she said without greeting. "Who sent you?" She did, and she left. That night I didn't go. I stayed in the room with the light on until I fell asleep with my clothes on. The second dream was worse, complete darkness in the forest, and I knew, with that strange certainty of dreams, that something was moving around me. I couldn't see it. I could feel it. The weight of a presence that was not human, circling around me like an animal studying its prey. And then Clementina, in front of me, so close that I could see the reflection of something non-existent in her amber eyes. I didn't come, I told her. It doesn't matter anymore, she said. You're here now. And in the dream I understood what she meant, that the here was not the forest, that it was something she had placed in me, that the tea was not just tea. I woke up screaming. Esther was knocking on my door. You need to leave the village, she told me when I opened. Tomorrow morning. I left the next day. I paid for the boarding house, stuffed everything into my backpack without organizing it, and took the first transport to the city. I looked out the window the whole way, watching the forest recede. I thought that distance would solve everything. It didn't. The nightmares continued for weeks. Clementina appeared in my dreams with a regularity that had no explanation. Not always in the forest, sometimes in my apartment, standing in front of the window, looking outside as if waiting for something. Sometimes in the cafe where I worked, on the street in front of my mother's house. Always still, always with those eyes. And I began to notice other things, objects that I remembered placing in one spot that appeared in another. The feeling, upon entering a room, that someone had just left. A smell that sometimes came without apparent reason. Herbs, something smoky, something sweet. The exact smell of Clementina's house. I went to a psychologist. She told me it was mild post-traumatic stress, that my mind was processing the experience in ways that seemed supernatural, but had neurological explanations. She gave me exercises for anxiety. The exercises didn't work. 3 months after returning, I found a bundle. It was in the inner pocket of my work backpack, the one I used every day. The same type of bundle. Dried herbs, seeds, cloth, red thread. But it wasn't the same. It was a new one. I placed it on the table and stared at it for a long time. Then I threw it down the sink, crushing it with my fingers until it broke into pieces. The smell that was released when it opened was exactly the smell of Clementina's house. That night I had the worst dream up to that point. The forest had light, but it was a light that came from below, from the very ground, as if something beneath the earth were burning. And in that light, I saw what Clementina really was, what was hidden beneath the form of the hunched old woman. I am not going to describe what I saw, not because I can't, but because there are things that lose something when put into words. What I saw had no name in any language I know. It was ancient, it was enormous, and it looked at me with something that, if I had to give it a name, I would call hunger. I woke up and vomited. I called Esther the next day. I told her everything, the dreams, the objects, the smell, the bundle in the backpack. Esther remained silent for a long moment. I was afraid this would happen, she said. There is a person who can help you. A woman who lives on the other side of the village, near the lake. Her name is Sophia. She knows about these things. Why didn't you tell me before I left? Because I hoped it wouldn't be necessary. I returned to the village 2 weeks later. I know it seems counterproductive, but what Esther explained to me, what Sophia would later confirm, was that distance does not break this kind of bond. Running away doesn't help. What Clementina weaves, she weaves into you, not in the place. Sophia was a woman in her 50s, tall, with short gray hair, and a direct expression that contrasted with everything I expected. There was no artificial mystery about her. She made me sit down, served me water, asked me to tell everything from the beginning, and listened without interrupting. When I finished, she nodded as if what I had described confirmed something she already knew. The tea, he said. She gave you something in the tea. Not poisonous, a bond. It's what they do to anchor someone. Anchor for what? Sophia took a moment. Clementina has been feeding off something we produce unknowingly for decades. Fear, disorientation, that energy that comes out when someone can't sleep and doesn't understand why. She chooses them. Not everyone, some. Those who have something that interests her. How is it broken? It's not easily broken, but it can be weakened until she loses interest. You have to take away her sustenance. What sustenance? The fear, Sophia said. If you stop being afraid, she loses the thread. Not immediately, but over time. I stayed looking at her. Are you telling me that the solution is to not be afraid? I know it sounds simple. It's not. I'm not talking about pretending.
I'm talking about reaching a point where you genuinely accept what exists and don't give it the energy of your terror. I spent 3 days with Sophia. We did things that at another time in my life would have seemed ridiculous to me. Cleaning my belongings with plants that Sophia grew, which smelled exactly the opposite of Clementina's plants. Basil, rue, something like pine and lemon. A long meditation in which Sophia asked me to imagine the thread that Clementina had put in me, to see it thinning, losing color, becoming transparent. On the 3rd day, Sophia told me something I didn't expect. You need to see her. No, I said immediately. Not to talk to her, just to see her, so that your brain registers that she is an old person in a small house, not the monster that has been building up in your dreams. Fear feeds on the image you have of her, which grew larger in your absence. Seeing her in reality reduces it. I didn't want to do it. I spent an entire night turning it over in my mind. But the next day, I went. I walked down the dirt path toward the forest. The garden was the same. The plants in their unruly explosion, the strange colors for the season. Clementina was sitting on a wooden bench in front of the door, looking down the path, as if she were waiting for me. I stayed at a distance. I just looked at her. She was an old woman, small, with a hunched back under the weight of the years. Her amber eyes found mine and held there, and in that gaze, there was something I recognized from dreams, that ancient and hungry thing. But it was also just a gaze, the gaze of an elderly person in a garden. I didn't say anything, she didn't either. After a minute, I turned around and went back the way I had come. That night I slept without dreaming for the first time in months. The dreams took weeks to completely disappear, and the smell still appears sometimes, in moments I don't expect, when I'm doing something completely mundane. When it happens, I breathe, I recognize it, and I don't give it more than it deserves. 6 months ago, I stopped dreaming of Clementina. I don't know if that means it's over. Sophia told me that these bonds don't completely break, that they weaken until they become harmless. I don't know if that's true or if it's simply what I needed to hear in order to function. What I do know is this: there is something in certain places and certain people that doesn't fit into the version of reality we are taught. I don't care what name we give it. What matters to me is that it is real, and that some people know how to use it. I was lucky. I found Sophia. I returned in time. But sometimes, when the wind brings that smell for no apparent reason, I wonder if luck was enough. If the thread really weakened, or if it just became invisible. And on those nights I sleep with the light on, although it doesn't help me as much as I would like anymore. That was all Valentina wanted to share. She wrote to me at the end of her message that she hopes someone else has gone through something similar, that they don't feel alone in this. If you know the folklore of the South, if you've heard about the voladoras, or if something similar has happened to you, tell me in the comments. I love reading what you all experience, and if you are not subscribed to the channel yet, consider doing so. There are many more stories like this waiting. Sleep well tonight. We'll talk soon. There are stories that come with a particular calmness, almost as if the one writing them has already made peace with what they experienced. This is the case of Rodrigo, a photographer who wrote to me a few weeks ago, telling me what happened to him during a week in an abandoned mining town in the north. If you're hearing this for the first time and you like this kind of content, consider subscribing. We publish new stories regularly. But now, close your eyes if you want, get comfortable, and let me take you to that town where the wind drags dust from decades, and where Rodrigo discovered that some people do not know, or do not want to, that it is already time to leave. I have been a photographer since I was 22. Not the kind of photographer who does weddings or graduation portraits, although in my early years I did everything to pay the rent. My passion has always been documentary photography. The places that are no longer in use, the spaces that time abandons but does not completely erase. Closed factories, emptied hospitals, towns that lost their reason to exist when the mine ran out or the road went another way. Those places have something that active cities do not have: a brutal honesty. They don't pretend anything. They show exactly what they are. I have been doing this for 20 years. I have slept in buildings without light, walked through corridors where the ceiling threatens to give in, spent nights in places that most people would instinctively avoid. I was never superstitious. I never believed in ghosts, in presences, in any of that. Abandoned places seem to me exactly what they are: places. Stone, wood, metal, dust. Nothing more. What happened to me in Hierro Viejo changed that. Not entirely because I am a stubborn man and stubbornness has its advantages. But it changed something in me that I didn't know was there before. The absolute certainty that the world is exactly what I can measure and photograph. That certainty fractured in Hierro Viejo, and it has not fully closed again. I arrived in the town in October, with a week of free time and an informal assignment from an editor who wanted material for a book about northern mining. Hierro Viejo had been a fairly sizable mining town in its day, 3,000 or 4,000 inhabitants during its peak years, with its church, its school, its square, its market. When the mine closed in the 70s, people left in successive waves until perhaps 20 families remained, then 10, and then none. By the time I arrived, the last permanent resident had died almost 15 years earlier, or so I thought. The nearest active town was called San Damaso, about 40 minutes by road. There, I settled into the only available guest house, which was actually the large house of a lady named Doña Amparo, who rented out 2 rooms on the second floor to those in need. Doña Amparo was about 70 years old, with her white hair tied up, a domestic efficiency that brooked no discussion, and a permanent expression of someone who has seen enough of life not to be easily surprised. When I told her where I was going to photograph, she nodded without comment. Then, while handing me the key to the room, she added without looking up, "If you're going to stay late in the old town, come back before it gets dark." I asked her why. "The road gets bad at night," she said. "The stones, the holes. It's not advisable." It was a practical and reasonable answer. I accepted it as such. The next day I went to Hierro Viejo for the first time. The access was a dirt road that, after 20 minutes, turned into a path of 2 parallel tracks between dry grass. The northern dust rose with every movement, covered the windshield, and got into the crevices. When I got out of the car and walked the last 100 meters to the edge of the village, the wind carried that dust in cold gusts that stuck to my clothes and hair. The village spread out in a hollow surrounded by bare hills. From above, you could see the entire layout. The main street in the center, the secondary streets branching out to the sides, the church in the background with its incomplete tower, the black mouths of some abandoned mines in the surrounding hills. Everything in ochre and gray tones, the color of things that the sun and dust have been erasing for decades. It was exactly the kind of place I love to photograph. I spent that first day exploring, without shooting much, just walking and looking. I like to get to know a place before I start photographing it, letting my eyes get accustomed to its particular geometry. The half-collapsed adobe houses, the empty windows framing the sky like photographs within photographs, the church floor covered with dead pigeons and fallen branches, the rusty rails that came out of the main entrance of the mine and disappeared up the hill. I returned to San Damaso before sunset, as Doña Amparo had said. On the second day, I brought all the equipment and started working seriously. The northern light in October has a particular quality, harsh and direct in the central hours, but with a strange warmth in the early morning and late afternoon that makes the abandoned surfaces seem almost alive. I had been photographing for hours, moving from one structure to another, lost in that state of total concentration which is the only way I know how to work well. It was that afternoon while photographing the interior of the church, when I noticed something strange in the viewfinder. It was framed in the main altar, a pile of splintered wood and fallen plaster that still retained remnants of golden paint. Light streamed in obliquely through the side windows, creating stripes of light and shadow over the debris. A perfect composition. But in the viewfinder, in the right corner of the frame, there was something that shouldn't be there. A figure, or something that looked like a figure. A dark, vertical shape, in the threshold of what had been the sacristy. I saw it clearly in the viewfinder for perhaps 2 seconds, and then nothing. I lowered the camera and looked directly at the threshold. Empty, just shadow and dust. I raised the camera again. The threshold in the viewfinder was empty. I archived it as a game of shadows, the kind of things that the tired eye builds in spaces with irregular light. I kept photographing, but I shot a series of frames towards that threshold just in case. That night, reviewing the images on the laptop screen, I enlarged the shots of the interior of the church. In most of them, the threshold of the sacristy was empty, as it should be. But in one image, the one I took exactly when I saw the figure in the viewfinder, there was something. It was not a clear figure. It was rather a different density in the shadow, a concentration of darkness that had a certain vertical shape. It could have been anything. A fallen beam, a buildup of dust, An effect of the camera sensor with that particular light. It could have been. I saved it and continued reviewing the other images. On the third day, I took a guide. Not because I needed him for orientation, but because I wanted to access the mines, and doing it alone seemed genuinely reckless. Felipe was a man in his 50s from San Damaso, who had known Hierro Viejo since he was young, when there was still some activity in the last mines before the final closure. He was quiet, few words, with that economy of expression of people who live in places where silence is the norm. We climbed to the main mine along the rusty rails. The interior was everything I expected and more. Stone walls with mineral veins that glimmered faintly in the light of the helmets. Wooden beams that time had made fragile as paper. Forgotten tools that rust had turned into abstract sculptures. I was photographing for hours, completely absorbed. Felipe accompanied me at a prudent distance, not getting into the frames, speaking only when he warned me of something structurally dangerous. At one moment, while I was photographing a side gallery that sank into darkness, Felipe approached me and said quietly, "Let's not go any further in that direction." I asked him why. "That branch is the oldest. There was a collapse a long time ago." He paused. "Several died." I asked him how many. 11, I think, or 13. The records from that time weren't accurate. Felipe looked into the darkness of the branch with no particular expression. "They never got them out. The collapse was very deep. They stayed inside." I slowly lowered the camera. "They stayed inside," I repeated. "Are their bodies still there?" "Yes." I stared at the darkness of the branch for a moment. Then I asked, "When was that?" 1948 or 49, before I was born." Felipe shrugged. "The people in the village remember them. There's a list of names in the church, or there was. I don't know if it's still there." We returned to the church in the afternoon. The plaque was still there, on the side wall, a corroded metal plate with 13 names engraved. I read them one by one with the flashlight. Common names, names from the north, names that had belonged to real people who, on a day in 1948 or 1949, entered that mine and did not come out. I photographed the plaque, and while I did, with the cold of the abandoned church in my fingers and the wind coming through the broken windows, I felt something that I couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't exactly fear, it was more of a feeling of being watched, not in a threatening way. Just the impression that something in that space was paying attention to my presence. I ignored it, or I tried to. That night I told Felipe, while we were having dinner in San Damaso, about the figure I had seen in the viewer the day before. Felipe listened to me without changing his expression. Then he said, "In the sacristy?" At the threshold of what was the sacristy, yes. He nodded slowly. The priest who was here when the town still had people said that sometimes he saw things in that church. Felipe took his coffee. After the collapse, some of the miners were very devout. Their families went to church to pray for them, who were still inside, without a Christian burial. He paused. Maybe some of them went too. He said it with the same calmness with which he had said everything else. As information, not as drama. On the fourth day, I went alone to Hierro Viejo. I wanted to spend the whole day in the church and the nearby streets. There was something in the light of that place that I had not finished capturing. Something in the way the afternoon fell on the facades and turned the color of the adobe into something almost alive. I arrived early, before the sun was high, and began to work methodically. I spent the morning outside, in the streets, in the yards of the collapsed houses. The wind was constant and carried that northern dust that gets into everything. I entered the church after noon. The light at 2 in the afternoon inside was completely different from that of the morning or the evening. Harder, without the warmth of the extreme hours, but with a clarity that allowed seeing details that were lost at other times. The faded frescoes on the walls, the cracks in the ceiling that let in strips of sky, the uneven floor where the tiles had given way. I had been working for a couple of hours, moving slowly, changing angles, waiting for the exact light before shooting. And then I saw her. Not in the viewfinder this time. Directly, with my eyes, without the mediation of any equipment. I was at the threshold of the sacristy, exactly where I had seen her before. A figure of a man, standing still, dressed in work clothes, dark pants, a shirt, boots with gaiters like those used in the mines decades ago. I couldn't see his face clearly because the light from behind cast him in shadow, but the figure was unmistakably human in its posture, in its proportion, in the way it seemed to be simply standing and looking at me. I remained completely motionless. My first reaction, was to think it was a real person, that there was someone else in the village, perhaps an explorer or a curious person who had arrived on their own and was also photographing or visiting the place. It was the logical explanation, and I clung to it for several seconds. But the several seconds passed, and the figure did not move. It made no gesture. It did not speak. I was simply standing in that threshold with a stillness that is not the stillness of a person waiting, but the stillness of something that has stopped needing to move. I slowly raised the camera and pointed it at the threshold. In the viewfinder, the figure was there. I shot, and at the moment I shot, the figure disappeared. It did not walk, it did not move. It simply ceased to be. I stood there with the camera in my hands, looking at the empty threshold, for what seemed like several minutes. My heart was pounding with a force that had no rational justification for the situation, and that alone, that racing heart, told me something that my mind was still trying to reject. I walked to the threshold of the sacristy. I entered. The room was small with a boarded-up window, the floor covered in debris, shelves fallen against the walls. There was no one. There was nowhere a person could have hidden in the second between when I shot and when I got there. I returned to the main ship of the church, picked up my equipment, and left. I sat on the steps of the entrance with the afternoon sun on my face and the dry wind from the north, and tried to organize what had just happened. I am a methodical man. I am a man who works with images and knows what eyes and cameras do with light in certain spaces. I had a list of possible explanations and went through them one by one. None convinced me. That night in Doña Amparo's room, I reviewed the images from the day. The shot I had taken at the moment I saw the figure was one of the best of the week. The perfect light, the perfect framing, the composition I had been looking for, the threshold of the sacristy in the background, framed by the perspective of the nave, and on the threshold, a density, a shape. Not as clear as what I had seen with my own eyes, but defined enough for anyone looking at it to say, there is something there. I enlarged it to the maximum. Pixels, digital noise, the limits of resolution. But even so, even with the image broken down into its minimal units, there was something at that threshold that had the shape of a person. I saved the image and turned off the laptop. The next morning I had breakfast early, and before leaving I told Doña Amparo what I had seen. Not because I needed her validation, but because something in me needed to tell someone who knew the place. She listened to me without interrupting, her hands on the coffee cup. And when I finished, she nodded in a way that didn't surprise me, as if she already knew. In the church? She asked. Yes, at the threshold of the sacristy. My mother told me that this happened. Doña Amparo didn't lift her gaze from her cup. When the town still had people, some said that sometimes in the church one could see one of the miners from the collapse. Always the same one. No one knew which of the 13 it was. She paused. My mother said it wasn't something to be scared of, that he was just there, that he never did anything to anyone. Do you know why he's in the church? I asked. If he died in the mine. Doña Amparo thought for a moment. My mother said he was the youngest, that he was 16 or 17 years old, that he was very devout, went to mass every day. She looked up and met my gaze. Maybe that's the only place he knows he can be. I remained silent, processing that. And the others? The other 12? In the mine, I suppose. Doña Amparo shrugged with a calmness that only those who have lived with a certain idea their whole life possess. Everyone stays where they can. On the 5th day, I returned to Hierro Viejo. I know it may seem like a strange decision after what I had experienced, but I am a photographer, and what I had seen the day before was, in a way I still didn't know how to articulate, the most important image I had made in 20 years. I couldn't leave without understanding what I was photographing. I arrived at the church mid-morning. I entered slowly, allowing my eyes to adjust to the dim interior. The main nave was empty and silent. The threshold of the sacristy was empty as well. I placed my equipment on the ground and sat on what remained of one of the benches, facing the altar. I didn't shoot anything. I just sat in silence. I don't know exactly how long I was like that. An hour, maybe more. The wind outside, the occasional creak of the wood under the midday heat, the pigeons on the roof, and then, without drama, without prior signal, the figure was back in the doorway.
The same posture, the same stillness, the same work clothes from another time. This time I didn't lift the camera. I sat still and looked directly at her, with the same calm with which she, or he, looked at me. I don't know how long that lasted. Probably less than it seemed. And at some point, not knowing exactly why I did it, I said aloud, in the silence of that abandoned church, "You can leave now. You've been here too long." I said it like one says something when one doesn't know if it makes sense to say it, but something in oneself insists that it does. Without drama, without fear now, simply as one tells something to someone who needs to hear it. The figure in the doorway didn't move, but something in the church changed. A subtle variation in the quality of silence, like when someone opens a window in a closed room and the air moves for the first time, and then the figure was gone. This time it didn't disappear suddenly. It left gradually, like smoke when the wind carries it away, so slowly that I couldn't identify the exact moment when the threshold was definitively empty. I sat there for another 10 minutes on that bench, in silence, listening to the wind and the pigeons and the creaking of the old wood. Then I gathered my equipment and left. I spent the rest of the day photographing the outside of the village, the streets, the hills around, the mouths of the mines seen from afar. I didn't go back into the church. That afternoon, back in San Damaso, I stopped by Felipe's house and told him what had happened. He listened to me in the same way he listened to everything, without surprise, without disbelief, with that calm attention of someone who accepts that the world has more layers than one can see at first glance. When I finished, he said, "Do you think he left?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "I think something changed. Whether that means leaving or not, I have no way of knowing." Felipe nodded. "Sometimes it's enough for someone to say it," he said. "For someone to notice and say it out loud. For someone to acknowledge that they've been there too long." He paused. 16 years. No one ever came to look for them. The town emptied out and left them alone. I kept thinking about that. 13 people dead in a mine in 1948, in a town that emptied until no one was left to remember them. And one of them, the youngest, going every day to the only church he knew because it was the only place he knew he could be. On the 6th and 7th day, I finished the work. I photographed what I was missing, reviewed all the material, did the work of sorting and editing. I returned to the church one last time, on the final day, to take some shots of the plaque with the names. The threshold of the sacristy was empty all that morning. I don't know if that means anything or not. I don't know if what I saw was what I think it was, or if it was something my mind constructed with the help of the story Felipe had told me, and the particular quality of the light in those spaces. I am a photographer, not a paranormal investigator, and I have too much respect for intellectual honesty to claim more than I can know. What I do know is this: I have a photograph, an image of that threshold with something inside that shouldn't be there. And when I look at it, I don't feel what I feel when I look at a technical anomaly or a light effect. I feel something else, something that doesn't have a precise name but that I now recognize as real. The image is in the book published by the editor. It appears on page 74 without a caption explaining what it shows, just the threshold of a sacristy in an abandoned village in the north, with something in the shadow that has the shape of a person. So far, no one has asked me what it is, and I don't know what I would answer if they did. End of Rodrigo's story. He told me that the book sold well, that several readers wrote to him asking about that specific photograph on page 74, and that he replied the same to all. That it was a light effect. That he doesn't know if they believe him. I found it a story that speaks of something beyond fear, of the loneliness of those who are left behind, and what it means for someone to finally notice them. If you felt something from this story, I would like to read it in the comments. And if you have your own story that you want to share, you know where to find me. Sleep well. We'll talk in the next one. I want to share with you something that recently reached me from a listener named Valeria. She wrote to me late at night, and that alone told me something about the state she was in when she did. There are people who need to tell their story to someone before it weighs too heavily on them, and I think that was her case. If you also have something kept inside that no one has heard, write to me. There is always a place for that here.
But now let me tell you what happened to Valeria when she returned to the town where she was born, to a house that had been closed for years, and discovered that some doors do not close even if you lock all the locks in the world. I did not want to go back. That is the first thing I need to say. Because if someone had asked me at any point in the 10 years prior if I would ever return to Noria Chica, the answer would have been no, a clear no, without hesitation, without that pause that betrays doubt. Not because I had bad memories of the town exactly, but because I had built my life far away from there with a lot of effort, and childhood places have that ability to undo you if you let them. But my mother died in January, and the house was left alone. I am a nurse. I have been working night shifts in a city hospital for 6 years, and if there is one thing that job teaches you, it is to function under pressure, to keep your head when everything around you is falling apart. What happened to me in Noria Chica challenged all of that. And still, months later, there are nights when I wake up with the smell of that house in my nose and my heart racing as if something is chasing me. I arrived in March. The idea was to spend 2 weeks sorting through my mother's things, deciding what to do with the property, and returning to the city. A simple, concrete, executable plan. The kind of plan that works for me when emotions threaten to overflow. Noria Chica is a mountain village, one of those that remain stuck in time, not out of romanticism but out of forgetfulness. About 200 people, a church, a store, dirt streets that turn to mud with every rain in March. My mother's house was at the end of the village, almost touching the boundary with the low hills that surrounded the valley. I arrived in the afternoon, when the sun was already quickly falling behind the hills, and the cold of the mountains sharpened the air. The key was with the neighbor across the street, a woman who had taken care of the house since my mother fell ill and went to the city hospital never to return. The woman was named Primitiva. She was about 70 years old, and looked at me when I arrived with an expression that I, who am used to reading faces of people who hide things, immediately identified as caution. It was not distrust towards me. It was something else. Something more like the way people look at someone who is about to enter a place where they know something is not right. She gave me the key, told me that if I needed anything, she was across the street, and before I turned around, she added in a low voice, "Don't light candles in the back room. I know your mother used to, but you shouldn't." I asked her why. She looked at me for a second, pressed her lips together and said, "Because you don't know what she knew." And she entered her house before I could ask her more. I stood on the dirt street with the key in my hand and the cold evening wind moving my hair, looking at the facade of my mother's house. It was a house like all the others in the village. Whitewashed adobe walls, small windows, a dark wooden door with iron fittings. Ordinary in every sense. I entered. The smell was the first thing. Every closed house has its own smell, a mix of time standing still and materials aging on their own. But the smell of this house had something more, something I took time to identify and finally recognized as copal. Resin incense, the kind that is burned in clay braziers. My mother always used it since I was a child, but I had associated it with her religious devotion, with the candles she placed on the altar of the main room, with that mix of Catholicism and popular custom that many women of her generation have. Now, with Primitiva's words still in his head, that familiar smell felt different. I walked through the house with the phone's flashlight because the electric light took a few minutes to respond. Kitchen, living room, 2 bedrooms, bathroom, everything covered in that light dust that accumulates when a house has been without human movement for months. The altar was still in the main room. Extinguished candle, image of St. Jude, a photograph of me as a child that surprised me to find there, a rosary rolled up on a dark stone that I didn't recognize, and at the end of the hallway, the closed door of the back room. That room had always been closed. As a child, when I lived there, I was forbidden to enter. My mother never explained to me why, and I accepted it with that instinctive obedience with which children accept rules they perceive as important. It wasn't a punishment room, nor a place where my mother kept valuable things. It was simply a closed room, and the closed door was enough of a signal. That night I didn't try to open it. I touched it with my fingers as I passed by, just that, and I noticed that the wood was cold in a way different from the rest of the house. Not the normal cold of an unheated room. Something more concentrated, denser, like the cold you feel when you open a refrigerator. I settled into the master bedroom, warmed up some food I had brought from the city, and fell asleep early. Nothing happened the first night. Nothing happened the second night either. I spent the day organizing the kitchen, sorting clothes, taking bags to the village church where there was a lady who distributed donations.
The physical work was good. It kept me grounded in what I could see, touch, and move. It was in the afternoon of the second day when I met Don Castulo. He was the oldest man in the village, or at least he looked like it. He arrived at the door of the house unannounced, wearing an old straw hat and an expression that was not exactly friendly, but not hostile either. It was the kind of face one sees on people who have decided that courtesy is fine, but honesty is better. He told me that he had known my mother since they were children, that they had grown up together in that town, and that when he learned I had come to close the house, he wanted to talk to me. I led him into the kitchen. I offered him coffee. He sat down with the slowness of someone whose bones have been working for many years and clasped his hands on the table before speaking. "Do you know what your mother kept in the back room?" he asked bluntly. "No, it was always closed." Don Castulo nodded as if that was what he expected. "Your mother was a good woman," he said. "But she carried something she didn't choose to carry. She inherited it, like certain things are inherited in certain families." He paused. "Do you know where your maternal grandmother came from?" "From some town around here, I think. I don't know the exact name." "From Carboneras." Don Castulo pronounced the name with a particular inflection, like someone naming a place they would rather not name. "In Carboneras there was a woman a long time ago who did something she shouldn't have. I'm not going to tell you what, because knowing it doesn't change anything. What I will tell you is that what he did stayed in the family. It passed to his daughter, and from his daughter to the next one, and so on until your mother." "What exactly stayed?" I asked. Don Castulo looked at me for a moment before answering. "A deal with something that doesn't have a decent name." He paused. "Your mother knew how to keep it under control. She knew what to do to keep it from leaving the room. She had been doing it for decades. But she's not here anymore, and the room has been unattended for months." I felt a coldness that wasn't from the air. "Attend to it how?" "Offerings. Certain herbs. Copal." Don Castulo opened his hands on the table as if explaining something that should be obvious. "There are things that sleep if you give them what they ask for, and there are things that wake up if left unattended for too long." I stayed silent for a moment, processing that with the part of my brain that has been a nurse for years and has a highly developed filter to separate what is real from what is altered perception or superstitious belief. But there was something about Don Castulo that didn't fit the profile of someone who is delusional or exaggerates. He was a straightforward man, without embellishments, who spoke about everything with the same factual matter as he might talk about the weather or the harvest. There was no drama in him, just information. "What's in that room?" I asked him. "I don't know for sure," he said. "I've never been in. No one has, except your mother and, before her, your grandmother. What I know is what I've seen from the outside over the years." He paused. "I've seen light under that door on nights when the house was empty. I've heard things. And I've seen your mother come out of that room with a face that wasn't the face of someone who had been doing something ordinary." That night, after Don Castulo left, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the hallway door that led to the back of the house. From where I was, I couldn't see the door to the back room, but I could feel its direction, if that makes any sense. Like when you're in a room with someone you don't want to look at, but you know exactly where they are. I didn't open the door that night, but I didn't sleep well either. I woke up at 3:15 in the morning for no apparent reason, with that sudden clarity that sometimes interrupts deep sleep. The room was silent, the house was silent, and the village outside was in that particular silence of small towns at dawn, which is a different silence from the city, older, more complete. I stayed still, listening, and then I heard it. It was coming from the back of the house, from behind the closed door. It was a low sound, almost at the limit of what is audible, with that particular quality of sounds that you're not sure you're really hearing. A murmur, not exactly a voice, or maybe it was a voice, but processed through something that distorted it until it became almost unrecognizable. It had a rhythm. That was what disturbed me the most, that it wasn't random. It was repetitive, rhythmic, as if someone were reciting something over and over in a very low voice. I sat on the bed and listened for several minutes. The murmuring did not stop. I picked up the phone, turned on the flashlight, and walked down the hallway until I stood in front of the back room door. There, up close, the sound was clearer. Definitely a voice, or something imitating a voice. And beneath the sound, something else. A smell.
faint but unmistakable. Sulfur and something sweet on top like rotting flowers. I placed my hand on the doorknob, and at that moment the sound stopped. Absolute silence, suddenly, like when a recording cuts off. I stood frozen with my hand on the doorknob for what felt like several minutes but was probably seconds. Then, very slowly, I withdrew it and walked back to my room. I didn't open the door. The next morning, I called Renata, my coworker at the hospital. I've known her since college. She's the person I trust the most. And she has that quality of listening without judging that is rarer than it should be. I told him everything over the phone. About Don Castulo, about Primitiva, what I had heard that night. Renata listened in silence and then said, "Did you open the room?" "No." "Good." A pause. "Valeria, I don't know what's in there, but listen. If your mother spent decades keeping that under control with certain rituals, and those rituals haven't been done for months, maybe it's not a good idea to open that door without knowing what you're doing." "Are you telling me to take witchcraft seriously?" I said, and there was a hint of nervous humor in my voice. "I'm telling you to take seriously the fact that something in that room makes noises in the early morning," Renata replied with her usual calm. "Call it whatever you want." I hung up and went to look for Don Castulo. I found him in his garden, working the land with that efficient slowness of old men who know their own rhythms. When he saw me coming, he stopped and waited, as if he knew I was coming with more questions. I told him what I had heard during the night. Don Castulo did not seem surprised. He nodded slowly, wiping his hands on his pants, and said, "He woke up. He has gone months without offerings and finally woke up. What should I do?" The old man looked at me for a moment. "There are two options. The first is to do what your mother did. Keep him, take care of him, continue the rite so he sleeps again." He paused. "The second is to seal it. There is a way to close that forever, but it requires entering the room." "Do you know how?" "I know enough. I saw it done once many years ago, when your grandmother had to do it for the first time after receiving it from her mother." Don Castulo looked at me seriously. "But Valeria, you have to understand something before deciding. Entering that room without protection, without knowing what you are doing, is dangerous. What is there is not bad in the way people understand bad. It is ancient, and the ancient has its own rules." "What kind of protection?" "Copal first. Herbs, rue, rosemary, basil. A new white candle, unused. And this." He took something out of his shirt pocket that he held between his fingers. It was a small, dark seed tied with red thread. "Your mother gave it to me years ago to keep. She said that if anything happened to her and someone from her family came to close the house, I should give it to them." I kept looking at that small seed in Don Castulo's rough hand. "She knew I would come." "I think so." The old man placed it in my palm. "I think she planned it, in her own way. That afternoon I got the herbs. Primitiva gave me the copal without questions, with that expression of someone who knows more than they say and who chose long ago not to say it. She also gave me, without me asking, some handwritten sheets that I immediately recognized as my mother's handwriting. They were instructions. I read them 3 times sitting in the kitchen, with the afternoon falling outside and the house in silence. My mother's handwriting was small and tight, the handwriting of someone who writes quickly because they have a lot to say and doesn't trust they have enough time. The instructions were specific and methodical, the kind of instructions written by a practical person, not someone given to mysticism. They said, how to light the copal, in what order to place the herbs, what words to say upon entering the room, how to use the seed and the red thread to seal what was inside, and at the end, in an even tighter handwriting, as if she had hesitated before adding it, do not look at it directly, no matter what it does or says. Do not look at it. That night I waited for it to be midnight. I know it sounds like something someone would do in a movie, waiting until midnight to confront something supernatural. But my mother's instructions said that the rite should be performed when the day was at its darkest point, and midnight was that. I didn't question it. I had stopped questioning many things since the night before. I prepared everything in the kitchen, the clay brazier I found on a high shelf, the copal, the herbs, the white candle, the seed with the red thread. I arranged everything on a tray and took it to the hallway. I stood in front of the backroom door with the tray in my hands and my heart pounding harder than I would have liked to admit. No sound came from the other side of the door. Complete silence. I lit the copal first, as the instructions said, The smoke rose white and thick, with that resinous and dense smell that filled the hallway in seconds. Then the candle, then the herbs, one by one, holding them over the smoke of the copal until the smell of all of them mixed. And then I said the words my mother had written. I'm not going to repeat them here. Not because I'm afraid someone will use them, but because there are things that belong to certain moments, and taking them out of that context turns them into something else. What I will say is that they were simple, direct words, without the drama one would expect. Almost more like a negotiation than a spell. And as I said them, with the copal smoking and the candle lit and the herbs in hand, I took the doorknob and opened the door to the back room. The cold hit me first. Not the cold of winter in the mountains, but something different. That specific cold I had felt when I touched the door 2 nights before, concentrated and dense. The room was small, smaller than I remembered from childhood, although I had never entered it back then. I had a small window with the shutters closed, the floor made of packed earth, and in the center a circle drawn on the ground with something dark, inside of which there was a pile of objects that I couldn't identify well in the candlelight. Stones, feathers, something that looked like bone, bindings of dry herbs, and in the corner, in the darkest part of the room, there was something. I remembered what my mother had written. Don't look at it directly. I kept my gaze on the circle on the ground. I saw, out of the corner of my eye, that there was a shape in the corner. I'm not going to describe that shape because honestly, I couldn't do it accurately. What I can say is that it had a quality of something that has been in a space for a long time, that has taken on the shape of that space, that is almost part of it. I felt it looking at me. I didn't look at it. I entered the room. 3 steps to the edge of the circle. I carefully placed the tray on the ground, and I followed the rest of the instructions. The herbs inside the circle, the copal in the center, the specific words that corresponded to that moment. And finally, the seed. The instructions said that the seed with the red thread should be placed at the point of the circle that faced the door, the point of entry, and that while doing so, I should say the name of the one who had initiated the deal. My mother had written that name at the end of the page, Remedios. My great-great-grandmother, a woman from Carboneras who had done something she shouldn't have, as Don Castulo had said, and that had left that in the family. I said the name. What happened next is the hardest to describe. The silence changed in quality. That's the best way I have to explain it. There was no sound, no visible movement, but something in the atmosphere of the room shifted, like when the air pressure changes before a storm. And in the corner, where the shape that I wasn't looking at directly was, I felt something compressing, condensing, becoming smaller, and then nothing. The cold receded, not suddenly, but gradually, like when a cold room warms up with heating. The smell of sulfur and rotting flowers disappeared, replaced only by the copal. I knelt next to the circle with the candle in hand for several minutes, without moving, making sure that what I felt was real and not just what I wanted to feel. Then I got up, took the empty tray, walked backward to the door without turning my back on the room, and stepped out into the hallway. I closed the door. I sat on the floor of the hallway with my back against the wall and my legs bent, and I breathed, long and slow. The type of breathing one learns in the hospital when they need to refocus. Once, twice, 3 times. The hallway was silent. The house was silent. That night, I slept without waking up. The next morning, I went to see Don Castulo and told him what I had done. He listened to me until the end, with that calmness of his that few things disturb at his age. And when I finished, he nodded. "Do you think it worked?" I asked him. "How do you feel?" he replied. I thought for a moment. "I feel like the house is different, lighter, if that makes sense." "It makes all the sense." He paused. "What your mother kept under control for decades and what you sealed tonight are things that weigh. They literally weigh, in the air, in the space. When they go away, the difference is noticeable." "Did it go away completely?" I asked. Don Castulo hesitated for a moment before answering, and that hesitation told me more than any direct answer. "What is well sealed doesn't disappear," he finally said. "It stays, but contained. Your mother contained it with offerings, which is a way of coexisting with that. You sealed it, which is different." He looked at me. "But you put the seal, being the first in your family to do so without having received it directly. That has its particularities." What particularities? That the seal lasts as long as the one who put it lives. Don Castulo looked at me straightforwardly. As long as you live, Valeria, it remains sealed. I stayed silent, processing that. And when I die, someone from your family will have to know, or the room will have to be closed in another way. A pause. But that is not a problem for today. I finished organizing my mother's things in the following days. I left the back room locked, the tray with the brazier inside, the circle on the floor intact. I didn't go in again. On the last day before I left, I went to say goodbye to Don Castulo. He told me to take care of myself, that old dealings sometimes have memory, and that if at any moment I felt something I shouldn't feel, not to ignore it. I promised him I wouldn't. And to Primitiva, the neighbor across the street, who was waiting for me at the door of her house when I passed by with my suitcase. I returned the keys to the house, and she took them without saying anything. But as I was leaving, she called me. Valeria. I turned around. She looked at me for a moment with that expression of hers, watchful and calculating. Your mother was a good woman, she said. And you did well. She didn't say anything else. She went into her house. I returned to the city. I went back to the hospital, to the night shifts, to the illuminated hallways, and the smell of disinfectant, and the routine I had built with so much effort. Ordinary life resumed its rhythm. But there are nights, especially winter nights when the cold has a certain particular density, when I wake up and listen to the silence of my apartment, searching for something that I don't exactly know what it is. A whisper, perhaps. A smell that shouldn't be there. So far, nothing. So far. That was all Valeria wanted to tell me. She said that writing it was a way to put it in order, to see if by putting it into words it lost some of the weight she had carried since then. I don't know if she succeeded, but I am grateful that she shared it. If this story reached you in some way, leave me a comment. And if you too carry something that you haven't been able to tell anyone, you know that there is a space for that here. Sleep well tonight. We'll talk soon.